Greetings, friends! Wanninger's here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of January 20th through January 26th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. Now let's get right into what happened this week. Now, we're going to start as always in the south and west direction, and this is where a lot of the action happened this week. In fact, the biggest news item that we have for you this week is the complete fall of Velyka Novosilka. The battle for Velyka Novosilka, which basically has been going on for about 2 months now, is now effectively over. The Russians have been raising their flags all over the place. They've raised them here, they raised them in the center, we saw them raise them in the south, and we also started seeing Ukraine's drone people in the north of Velyka Novosilka. So this entire area has fallen, and the Ukrainians have retreated back to these fields right here. These fields are in a bit of a high ground than along the river, and so they've retreated around Brulaski here. But there's like a bunch of, if you look at fortification maps, which I still have not found, hopefully I could find some. If you know what I'm talking about, a fortification map for all the Ukrainians, please send it to me in the comments. But from what I've seen, was that there's like a bunch of fortifications here, and this is where the Ukrainians retreated to. So, what the main action basically is the fall of Velyka Novosilka. This was the last bastion of the South Donetsk direction. Now, there is technically there's not a lot, but there's still some villages left in the South Donetsk direction in terms of administrative border. So here is how, the way the Donetsk Oblast works is that it kind of like, it's not like flat, it elongates like this administratively. And so there's still, in terms of the South Donetsk direction, everything below this red line is what's left of South Donbass. Now, as you can see, there's no other big towns. Karakova fell, Velyka Novosilka has fallen. There is no other, everything else is small little village huts. Now, just because that is the case does not mean that the Russians will just zoom by this. As we see in the north here, taking things village by village will still be a tough nut. So, but all the major towns in the area have been taken, and so the battle for South Donbass, not just the end for Velyka Novosilka, has basically been ended, because the Russians took the major two towns that held this this area. So what happened in Velyka Novosilka? What made it fall so fast? Well, basically, as we saw last time, that the Russians already encircled Velyka Novosilka, and once the Russians encircle something, it is game over. Once the area has been completely encircled, or at least encircled on 3 sides, I call that the Russian encirclement, because for some reason they don't actually like fully encircling the area, which I actually explain why that is. They would rather let people leave than let them fight to the last man. Which actually, that's what that actually didn't happen anyway. Even though the Russians left kind of this area in the north here for the Ukrainians to leave, the Ukrainians actually decided to stand and fight, which was commendable. But they all died, and only a few of them were able to escape. But from the sources are shown that they basically fought to the death, and they all they just fought to the last, especially the Ukrainians in the south here. These guys, in the early weeks, the Russians actually, when they started assaulting the town, the Russians crossed the river here, and they also broke into Velyka Novosilka from the east here, and actually managed to split this town in half. And then all the there was apparently still Ukrainians in the southern part of Velyka Novosilka, and so they got stuck here and then got liquidated. They actually decided not to surrender. They all decided to kill themselves. And so after that happened, the Ukrainians were just in the north here, and then the Russians cleared everything to the east here, and then as they took all the big buildings in the center of Velyka Novosilka and started raising their flags, the Ukrainians realized it was a hopeless situation, because then all they had was just a bunch of small buildings in the north left. The Russians were starting to cross over here, and they realized that, okay, fuck it, we need to leave. And so and then by the end of the week, like yesterday, the Russians basically captured the rest of the northern Velyka Novosilka. So that is how the battle kind of played out. The Russians, once the Russians do what I call the Russian-style encirclement, where they encircle it on 3 sides, let's call it the tripartite encirclement or whatever, because because 3 and whatnot. Anyway, but once that happens, the Russians then do attack it on all sides, and then they dissect it into pieces, and then they capture it. That is how the Russians like playing their city battles. So But yeah, the battle for Novosilka is over. Now, you might be wondering, well, what's going to happen now? I actually predict a slowdown in operations here. Just like after they captured Karakova, there might be still see some movements to improve their positions. The Russians might try to take this Ukrainian big trench network that's here they haven't captured yet. The Russians might, improve a little bit, but I don't expect any sort of big movements here. The Russians might improve a little bit, but it's going to be very slow. We're going to go back to very slow downville in the south and west direction. In fact, I think starting in February, I might not even start talking about South Donbass anymore. I might start focusing on Pokrovsk because that is where all the big gains are going to be starting to happen. So, yeah, that was the main one. Actually, one of the biggest news items for this week is the fall of Velyka Nosovka. The battle for South Donbass is basically over. The Ukrainians have some positions here. Some villages, but they don't mean any sort of operational or significance. But so yeah, that is the end of South Donbass. A little bit more here in the more Karakova area of the South Donbass area. There's been some changes. The Russians are slowly but surely trying to collapse what they call the Dachna pocket. As you can see, because of the advancements in the north and south, there is still a small pocket here that's remnants from the Karakova pocket, which is based around Dachna. And the Russians are slowly but surely constricting it, trying to reach Andriivka and Constantinople. What's happening this week actually is that the Russians actually entered Dachna. It looks like they are now finally. A lot of sources are saying that they've entered Dachna from the north here. They also took the southern part of Dachna and are trying to have some positions on the most eastern outskirts of Dachna. So the Ukrainians are still in Dachna. The battle for Dachna officially has begun. I still have no clue why the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to this. I would try to stop trying to funnel troops here. Or maybe they just told the troops here just to take a last stand. Everyone has to die as the rest of they're like, hey, we're not going to give you any more equipment. We're not going to give you any more infantry. You just have to die, and we'll just build up something here. That might be the case. But I would assume that they probably have to give up Dachna and try to go back to Constantinople and Andriivka so that then they're actually not surrounded. They can actually have a steady front line, and they'll have the troops to be able to hold off the Russians trying to encircle Andriivka and Constantinople. But anyway, the Russians are entering Dachna, and and not only that, the Russians are also clearing the fields in the south here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take Dachna and everything up here, everything behind this red line, within a week or something, week or two. Again, the Russians actually pulled a lot of troops from the Karakov area to other areas, so a lot of the assault brigades here moved away. But even with the smaller amount of forces here, the Russians could clean up this pocket because they already have it surrounded. Anyway, so yeah, in the south, the Russians captured a bunch of more of these fields in the south here. Just clearing out these areas. I think I mentioned this last week, but they also captured the wastewater treatment plant. And so the Russians will continue probably moving along the river here, probably up to Zelenovka, and then start probably pushing northwards and just trying to cut this road here, and then have Dachau be taken, and then the front line can go something along like this or something, and then that will be the end of the Dachau pocket, which is slowly being liquidated. I have no clue why the Ukrainians decided to keep holding it though. But anyway, that is what's happening there, and this is technically, I'll just call this part of the South Insurrection because it feeds to it. But the Russians in the north here, on the northern side of the Volga River, as they try to have actually started battling for the village of Andriivka, which is one of the main areas the Russians have been trying to reach. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians have been pushing through these fields and actually entered the most northeastern outskirts of Andriivka. Now, we don't know if the Russians have able to expand to their bridgehead here, or maybe they got pushed out. Because when the Russians try to enter, and now if you look also at the fortification maps in South Donbass, there is a bunch of fortifications, like all around Andriivka. Andriivka is actually one of the most heavily fortified areas, trench network-wise, in this area. So now it was supposed to hold off a Russian attack from the south, but since they're attacking from the east and north, the trenches aren't as prepared for that. But there's still a lot of very good trench networks here that the Ukrainians could use. So it's going to be tough enough to crack, but it looks like the Russians are finally cracking it. It looks like they're starting to enter it. The Russians tried to enter it directly from Shentenko, but the Ukrainians did a counterattack and pushed them out. So then the Russians moved a little bit more north and actually entered it again. So I don't know if the Ukrainians will do another counterattack to keep pushing them out. But in any case, the Russians have entered Andriivka, and now there's fierce battles for this village. So, but if the Russians are able to take Andriivka, then the main goal obviously would be to capture specifically this area, so that any supplies coming from here would be cut, and then there'll only be one road supplying Dashna. The main goal here probably is to then have a new front line going from Velyka Novosilka, kind of just flatten the front, something like this here. This will make everything more simpler. But yeah, so yeah, that is the South Donbass direction, and there's been no changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson directions as well. Alrighty, now let us go to the Pokrovsk direction, and this is also where a lot of interesting things have been happening. The Russians are continuously encircling Pokrovsk from the west. That is one of the biggest where the Russians are focusing on this week. We talked about how they started battling for the villages Kotlina and Udachna, and this week the Russians have completely captured the village of Kotlina. Last week, I think we talked about how they entered here and all that, but we have now 100% geolocated confirmation the Russians have entered. We have them in this farm in the north. We have them in this industrial zone. We have them especially in this the village itself. And we actually have them crawling in the fields to the north of Kotlina. So, and not only that, we also have them in taking, I forgot what they call those, like the wastewater plant or the treatment area, or what the fuck is this? I don't know. Some sort of thing. But in any case, the Russians are also moving in the fields here. One of the main things the Russians are trying to do is push through these fields, not only to try to start cutting off this road and this rail line, but also to start encircling another big Ukrainian fortress, the Pokrovsk mine, or the Pokrovsk factory, I think it's called. This is a mine or factory, maybe both. But anyway, it's this huge industrial zone, one of the biggest factories in Donbass, and the Ukrainians have built it up into a very big fortress, and the Russians need to take it. And again, the Russians are going to try to encircle it from the east here. But in order to do that, they also need to attack Dachna, so that once they take it, they can then start encircling it from the west here. But in any case, Kotlina has completely fallen, and now the battles are moving to Dachna. Most sources are saying the Russians have captured the eastern part of Udachna, and the battles are going on for the center. Specifically for the Udachna railway station, this area right here in the center. The reason why this has taken so long is because this is actually a very big railway station, specifically for the city itself, or for the village itself, because this rail line was supposed to carry all the mining or all the materials that they mine from this factory here. So it's actually bigger. It's not just a passenger railway. It's like a material railway. In any case, the battle for Udachna, I'm expecting the Russians to start fully focusing on Udachna. It will fall, but the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Udachna as much as possible. Because with the fall of Udachna, and if this will allow the Russians to start encircling this fortress, and then from there, that means after the fortress falls, then western Pokrovsk is effectively cut off, and the Russians can start focusing on starting to start clearing up the western part, and start trying to cut off Pokrovsk from the north here, which will spell doom for this agglomeration here. But anyway, as we continue going a bit more southern, in the southern part of Pokrovsk, as we saw, the Russians are now breaking through in these fields here. Most sources are saying they have reached this little lake here in the south of Udachna, which helps them, and they have taken this area, which helps them start, battling for the center. And along with this, the battle for Uspenica is still ongoing. Now, the thing, I talked about this last week, but the Russians are in the north and eastern part of Uspenica, and the Ukrainians are in the west. Now the thing is that this is taking, I don't know, maybe East Side is throwing a bunch of soldiers here, but it just speaks to how small those forces involved are. We're probably seeing the Russians send 6 troops here, and the Ukrainians send 3, and it's like a game of paintball gun or something. And so this, if you want to play a paintball gun with maybe your big group of friends, and you have all of Uspenica, yes, it'll take, it'll be fun, but fucking in a war, right? If this was the Second World War, right? There would be, this village would have been overrun, and no one would have held it because it would have been too much to hold. It would have been useless. But since this is a battle of ants, each village can be its own little paintball field, arena. So Uspenica is still being fought over, and every time someone falls, they just replace them with 1 or 2 guys. So yeah, Uspenivka is ongoing, and we shall see how that plays out. Alrighty. Yeah, and then as we continue going north, the Russians are still expanding from and trying to reach the Dnieper Oblast, trying to reach, they call this the Novopalovska direction, which makes sense. This is Novopalovka. Not so. I've talked about this before, but the reason why they're trying to reach Novopalovka is twofold. One is PR, and the second is first is actually it helps them a little bit, and then also there's a PR purpose. Now the reason why this helps is because Novopalovka goes with this red area is a river, and if the Russians can reach this allows them to basically have a front line along a river, which will be hard for the Ukrainians to cross if they want to counterattack the Russians. And so this is a good area to hold the western part as they advance towards Pokrovsk. But not only that, this also allows them to enter the Dnieper Oblast, and Novosilka will be the first big village that they capture here. Big, relatively speaking. This is still, it's pretty big. Well, big relatively. It's like one of the, it's not like Mezdova, which would be one of the first big towns taken. But Novosilka would be the first kind of big village captured in Dnieper, and it would be a PR victory. But hey, we've entered another oblast of Ukraine, but that is more of a PR thing. The Russians are also now advancing towards the village of Novosilka here. They've actually entered it, and just like Uspenivka, it is being fought over back and forth. And so, the Russians have entered the southern part of Novosilka and actually captured some fields to the south of here. Apparently, the Ukrainians are just held up in the northwestern part here. And so, again, just like in Uspenivka, there's back and forth here. This would have not happened if this was not a war of ants, but since each side is just kind of sending up forward like 5 guys each at a time, Novosilka, just like Uspenivka, is being fought over like a paintball field. So like for example, if hey, I'm gonna bring 12 of you guys, and we have all of Novosilka to ourselves to play paintball gun, shoot each other with paintballs. This is hey, there's a bunch, there's a couple 2 dozen buildings, some warehouses in the north. Hey, this would be interesting to fight over. We'll split each other 6-6, so it's a 6 versus 6, and we could hold up here and everything. But but again, that's why it would take forever to clear Novosilka. But if this was an actual big battle with a lot of soldiers, the Russians could send 30 guys in here and then clear this out quickly and then fortify their area from any Ukrainian attacks. But for some reason, they want to do it small piece by small piece. The Russians are also pushing more in the south here. They have actually completely captured the village of Novosilka. This map is not updated. The Russians have captured, after they captured the village of Yazunovka, they actually managed to push along here. They captured the fields to the south of Novosilka. They captured the fields to the north of Novosilka, and after that, this small little village basically collapsed, and now the Ukrainians retreated back to Syabrinka and Zaporozhye, these 2 villages, which is the next area where the Russians will push for. So the Russians have captured this. If the Russians could clear Novosilka pretty soon, then they could start swooping in from the south here, try to clear these fields, and then, from here, the Russians could then move maybe along this area in the south, and then they could probably try to take these 3 villages, which would be a good stepping stone towards the Dnieper Oblast. But yeah, Novosilka has fallen as well. And along with this, the Russians are now trying to push from Salonika and Petropolovka towards capture some of these fields here towards this road here. So this just helps help the northern sector as the Russians try to reach Andriivka here. So yeah, the push towards the Dnieper Oblast, the slow, I call this the slow and steady wins the race, or slow and steady makes this war go longer than usual. But slow and steady is the Russian way as they push towards the Dnieper Oblast. But step by step, they are slowly approaching it. But progress is still being made. That is what I report on. Alrighty, now let's go from the western part across towards what they call this the Minigrad direction, but I still kind of, I don't know if I want to break this into a different part of the front line, but it does serve a dual purpose. It serves purposes to helping Toretsk, and it also helps encircle Pokrovsk/Minigrad from the east here. But in any case, in this area, there's actually been some changes as well, mostly here. The Russians are actually pushing more to the north here. And so this week, the Russians have completely captured the village of Barnovka here. So the Russians are now, after they secured Vozhezhevka and, took a bunch of these fields here, the Russians are now pushing here, and actually managed to capture the village of Baranovka and took everything here. And so this helps them as they move forward towards the next village that they need to take, the village of Toretsk. And this also the Russians have entered the southern part of Zliny Polia. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians keep pushing northwards and try to capture this village completely, and then move towards Tartanovska. As you can see, the main purpose here is to continue pushing northwards towards the main goal here. It would be the village of Alexandra Kolonovo. I already talked about last week about how once the Russians take Toretsk, the Russians will then push along this way and try to reach the village of Alexandra Kolonovo. Again, the main purpose here is to liquidate this entire these northern fields here, which will be where the main goal is. And so the Russians are now pushing northwards here, and the taking of Baranovka, reaching Leopolia, that is the Russian push on the more western area as they move north here along this this like reservoir towards Alexandra Kolanova here. Yeah, and so we also have some geolocated footage of the Ukrainians blowing this up, so it looks like the Russians don't have any hard control over this area, but it looks like the Ukrainians blew this up, so this intersection is now completely worthless for the Ukrainians, so it can't use this anyway. So it looks like the Russians aren't actually here, but they are in these fields in the center between Vodoshevka and the road here. Alrighty, that is the Pokrovsk direction. Now let us go to the Toretsk direction, and this week, alright, I'm gonna say it, I know I have something to admit, guys. The teasing has gone on too much. This is, I tried to, give it the benefit. I'm going to use a little sleaze game show talk shit. I'm going to declare it now, and I'm going to declare in this video, the battle for Toretsk is over. Now, that is just for the city itself. The operational objectives, just because you took a city, does not mean you actually. It's less about taking. Again, with these military campaigns, it's less about taking a city and more about improving your tactical positioning. Taking a city is more of a PR thing. Now, cities are immensely important. Taking Toretsk is immensely important tactically, but there is still some in this Toretsk direction. There is still work to be done. I talked about this last week. What the Russians actually have to do, which is basically take everything up to here and then around here. So everything below this red line, they still have to take. And so the battle for this area is still going to be ongoing. I'd be surprised if they stopped, but I wouldn't actually be. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. I would not expect them to be stopped, but it would not surprise me. They might be like, okay, fuck, we took Toretsk, we're not going to regroup for like a month or something. That could be possible. Now, why do I finally say that Toretsk is gone? So, the Russians have completely captured, or mostly captured, the village of Krymsky. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being here, so they took everything here. And so basically, the last this Krymsky thing, which I believe is I swear this is like the Mandela effect. When I first started talking about the battle for Toretsk, like last year, I swear this was just part of Toretsk, and they never renamed it, but they apparently did. But in any case, this little suburb of Toretsk has been completely captured by the Russians. And not only that, we actually have some geolocated footage of the Russians being in the southern part of the mine, and I wouldn't be surprised if this mine has completely fallen to the Russians. Now, we don't have this is why I can't 100%, this is the last vestiges of the Ukrainians in Toretsk here. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if, once we see the Russian flag flying on top of this Terrakon, or, in the very northern outskirts, then we could officially claim the battle for Toretsk is over, but we don't see it, because maybe, I don't know. But everything else in Toretsk has been taken. We have the Russians all the way in the north here, and this was the last stronghold, and the Russians already captured, 2/3 of it, and took all of Krymsky. So I'm just calling it now. The battle for Toretsk itself is over. The Russians have taken it. And, yeah. And so I talked about what the Russians will probably do from this point. The Russians will start probably focusing on Shyrbrinka and Novopasky here and try to flatten this area here, take these two villages, and then from here I don't know what they'll do from here. Maybe they'll keep try to maybe attack and take this little mine shaft here. Maybe start moving along this rail line to capture Dachina and Dolinivka. I don't know, but I think the more after they clear up Toretsk, the focus will be on these two villages, which is also where a lot of things have been happening in the Toretsk direction anyway. The Russians are battling for the village of Shyrbrinka. The Russians are pushing here. They captured some more areas to the north here. They have captured most of the center and western part of Shyrbrinka. And I wouldn't be surprised if this entire village falls to the Russians, and only... I don't know where Shyrbrinka ends, to be honest. There's like a bunch of like little huts that go along this rail line. They go all the way up here, so I don't know where, but the bulk of Shyrbrinka will probably fall, and then from there the Russians will be able to liquidate whatever is in this little pocket here, and then kind of flatten things like this. So yeah, the Russians are battling for Shyrbrinka. They're always capturing it. They are in Novospassky, but the Ukrainians still on most of it, and this is probably where the Russians are focusing since the battle for Toretsk has officially ended. All right, now, so yeah, that is the battle for Toretsk. Alrighty, now let's go to the Chasiv Yar direction, and this week we have some updates in the Chasiv Yar direction. It looks like the battle for Chasiv Yar is now coming to a culmination point, and surprisingly, after there was this big battle for the refractory plant, the main industrial zone inside Chasiv Yar for the last month or two. After the Russians captured that, it looks like now the Russians have reached the end point and are now getting to the end here. Now, it's not over yet. The Ukrainians can still resist, but I could see Chasiv Yar be taken within a month or two. But anyway, let's talk about what actually happened this week. So this week, the Russians have officially completely cleared up this northern residential area. I forgot what they call this area, but we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians being here in the south, and we have some geolocated footage of the Russians being here. And so this entire northern area has been captured by the Russians, which is very good because the main citadel for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar is this high-rise building area. So the Ukrainians are trying to put up with everything they can to defend this area right here. Now, the biggest thing is that one thing is that if the Ukrainians want to continue defending this area, you have to leave the roads to connect it. And so with the fall of the northern part, and the Russians now entering what they call the smaller north western part, is that now they're cutting off all the supply lines that enter this area from the north here. And then from the south here, as the Russians broke through here and actually captured some high-rise building areas here, the Russians are now slowly cutting off all the roads that are entering it from the south. So slowly but surely, the Ukrainians are losing all their possibilities to resupply the central Chasiv Yar. And so once the center Chasiv Yar falls, then the battle for Chasiv Yar will be over. But the Russians will still have to do some cleaning up here. They'll have to take this quarry in the north here. They'll have to probably, take these quarries in the south and take the villages of Mykolaievka and Stupochki, just so they could have a big bridgehead here and actually be able to secure Chasiv Yar. But Chasiv Yar itself, in terms of its administrative borders, is basically just this area right here. Let me roll it out here. Something like this. And so the Russians have to just take everything within this red line to officially take Chasiv Yar, but they have to improve their positions to actually make it a tenable hold, or at least a better tenable hold. So yeah, the northern part has been captured by the Russians, and I expect the Russians are now going to be battling for this area right here and try to take everything here. And then as they do that, the Russians will also be pushing here. So now speaking of the south, though, one of the biggest areas where the Ukrainians were holding up was this forest. They have a bunch of trenches here that they put up here. So there was a bunch of trench networks all over here. And apparently this week, so we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians actually breaking into the forest here. So we have them in the very south of the southern forest. But according to a lot of pro-Russian sources, they say that this entire area has been cut. And this can make sense because, with the Russians breaking through here last week and the Russians now entering, this area, it wouldn't be surprising if the Russians actually took and actually linked up here and actually managed to capture this entire forest. We don't have a completely 100% geolocated confirmation of that just yet, but it would make sense. But in any case, once this area is captured, the Russians will be able to, how do you say it? Be able to start securing their gains in Chasiv Yar a lot better. So this forest has been cleared up. These northern residential areas has been cleared up. With that, the Russians will be able to put the squeeze on the center of Chasiv Yar, and I wouldn't be surprised if this falls sometime in February. And then once the center of Chasiv Yar falls, my guess is the Russians will then keep pushing south here to try to reach the northern part of Mykolaievka. The Russians will obviously try to capture these quarries in the south here, and and then continue pushing into Mykolaievka from the east, and then encircle this forest here, and then the front line will go something like this. And then at that point, then they'll be able to take Mykolaievka and also Stupochki once they take these quarries in the south here. Alrighty, that is Chasiv Yar. Let us now go. There's been no changes in the Seversk direction. Now let us go to the Liman direction, which is actually a very interesting front. This front used to have not a lot of cool things happening, but now there's a lot of cool things happening with what I call the Ivanovka Bridgehead. And so the Russians are expanding this bridgehead rapidly, and one of the main focuses is the village of Kosalovsky here. The Russians need to take this in order to get this is a good piece to be able to actually solidify their gains here, because again, with any sort of river like the Zhirbez River, it's on a very low ground, and then everything to the north here, and then everything to the or to the east and to the south and to the west are on higher ground. And so, the Ukrainians are holding on to Kolozovsky so they can have the high ground over Russian troops in Ivanivka and such. But the Russians are obviously trying to expand from their bridgehead. Now, we talked about how the Russians created this bridgehead, but they expanded this week. They actually managed to expand it to the north here by a little bit, reaching the Donetsk-Luhansk Oblast here and taking everything here. They also expanded their gains to the west a little bit and captured this area. We also have them expanding the south here, and they actually managed to take the village of Bilogorivka, which I don't think is a village. It's like one of those things that exists on paper but doesn't exist anymore. But in any case, where it used to be Bilogorivka has also been captured by the Russians, and they managed to take this area. And so, right now, but however, what's happening is that this is actually this is slowing the Russians down a little bit, is because the Ukrainians are actually doing massive counterattacks in the Liman direction, and are trying to push the Russians away from Kolodovsky here, which is where the main battles are going on. But if the Russians could fight back these counterattacks and actually take this village, then at this point they could then bloom out of here and start encircling Liman from the north here, which is what, again, this is the Liman direction. The main goal is to take the town of Liman. So we shall see how this bridgehead develops. It looks like, the Russians are having a very good time in expanding the bridgehead here. And we shall see if they could hold off any Ukrainian counterattacks, or if they have to basically stop and not be able to expand. But we shall see. Also in the Liman direction, the Russians are expanding their gains in Makivka. This is another bridgehead that they're expanding here. They actually managed to capture some places in the north of Makivka. This could help the Russians with, if they expand their Makivka bridgehead along with the bridgehead in the north here, they could probably actually start taking a huge chunk and actually link up these two bridgeheads, and then use this very big bridgehead to put a lot of troops here and then push forward towards the Oskol River in the south, just like as they did in the north here in Kupyansk, where they broke through and actually reached the Oskol River. But right now, the Russians have a bridgehead here, but let us see if they could continue expanding it and link up so then they could start encircling Liman from the north here. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kupyansk direction. There's actually one interesting thing here is also now one thing we want to. This is in the border zone between between Liman and Kupyansk. And is that we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags right in the very northern part or the more western part of Novigorivka, and in fact also in the village of Cherlobolovko here, this area. And so there's actually been a big, we talked about how the Russians talked about how they captured the village of Nadivka 2 weeks ago, and this week we have the Russians saying that they captured Novigorivka, and we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians being right in the part of Treligovko here. And so the interesting part is like how what's going on here, because we have how big are the advances, or we need some more footage here, but it looks like the Russians are trying to take everything here, and once they take these areas, not only does they take more of the Luhansk Oblast, they could then maybe push more to the north and maybe take the villages of Sapovo, Krasnevki, and Novosilka, and then they could have a front line something like this, and this could also expand their bridgehead towards Borova, which will help the Russians try to take Borova, which is another area where the Russians are trying to take. So the Russians are, again, another PR thing is trying to take the rest of Luhansk Oblast. There is still parts of it that are under Ukrainian control, like these 3 villages, but it looks like the Russians are now activating here and trying to link up with their forces in Stepovy and Kupyansk here. But yeah, so a little bit of a movement in the south here. Now, what's interesting, there's been no changes in the kind of where the main direction is in Kupyansk itself. This area, there's been no changes here. It looks like maybe the Russians are regrouping, or there's been such. But where the Russians, where there's another, this is like another week of bridgeheads here in this Luhansk area. But in this area, the Russians are expanding rapidly their advances into Kupyansk bridgehead, so this area in the north here. So let's talk about it. So this week, the Russians have completely captured the village of Zapata, and they actually managed to capture, and this is like kind of like what Kosinka is in the Liman area. The capture of Zapata gives them on a very higher elevation than again, this is a river, and usually with rivers, on every side it's on the low ground, but the farther you go on in either direction, it goes on higher and higher ground, because if it's on higher ground, all the water moves towards the bottom because of gravity, and then that's why there's a river. But in this case, so the capture of Zapata by the Russian forces, this map doesn't show it, but most sources are saying this village has been captured, is that with the capture of Zapata, this gives their bridgehead in the northern part of Kupyansk a lot more believability, a lot more secure, a better secure apparatus there, you could say. The Ukrainians in the village of Mononovka, if you look at elevation maps, are actually in a bit of a higher ground than Zapata, but it is not as big of a difference between them being on the river and this. But so the capture of Zapata allows them to maybe deflect any Ukrainians that try to use this village to try to counterattack. But with the capture of Zapata, this bridgehead we call this the Dorichnia bridgehead, because this is what's happening in the south here. Speaking of Dorichnia, most of this village has been captured by the Russians. Most pro-Ukraine sources say that everything in the south of the Dorichnia, because Dorichnia is kind of split in half by a river, and everything to the south of this river that splits Dorichnia has been captured. This is where the main Russian bridgehead here. The Russians have positions all over Dorichnia. As you managed to capture, this is a pretty big town. This is, I think, a former town of like a couple hundred people, I think. So it's a very solid area to hold up in. But again, the main thing for the Russians is that they'll have to capture some of these forests, just because Dorichia is right on the river, so it's on low ground, and so they have to expand themselves a little bit further to the west to secure it. But anyway, also the Russians have crossed the river here and have captured the northern part of Dorichnia. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take the rest of northern Dorichnia in the foreseeable future, and then use this as the main bridgehead to expand everywhere. So the Russians try to take the village of Novomolinsky here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to, once they take Dorichnia, maybe expand in the north a little bit, maybe capture something like this, just so they can have the northern sector a bit more, have some positions here, and then in the south they push in Zapata. And because the main goal here, obviously, of the Russians is try to encircle Kupyansk from the north here. So once they take Dorichnia and Zapata, I think the main goal then, the Russians will then push forward from to the west, take the village of Menonolivki here, and try to reach this where they'll be on the heights here. And then from here, the Russians can then use Monolichki to then keep pushing south and a little bit west, and start maybe taking these villages, and then moving south, and obviously at this point then they'll reach the northern part of Kupyansk, and then then they could use this area as a very solid area to start cutting Kupyansk from the west here. So taking Kupyansk will be a very, very big gain for the Russian, but again, this is still far away. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians don't take this till, this is slow gathering, so it might take by the summer or something. But this is a long-term thing, but it is something that is developing. So yeah, this week is the week of bridgeheads in this entire Oskol front in Liman and Kupyansk. Bridgeheads in Ivanovka, bridgeheads in Makivka, bridgeheads in Dorichnia. So yeah, that is the Kupyansk direction. Alrighty, now let's finally go to the Kursk direction. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. In the Kursk direction, the Russians are also keep on pushing here. Let's talk about what's happening in the south here first. First, the Russians are restarting their advances from their positions here and are right now battling for the village of Shilodolovkovko here. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians entering Shilodolovkovko, but that was about 2 or 3 days ago, and we don't know what the results of that were. We saw the Russians attacking here and disembarking infantry here. But if the Russians could take this and then take everything along this border and take everything here, this makes them get a lot more closer to the main supply line to Suchka, this highway here. If this highway gets cut, then it's game over for the Ukrainians in Suchka, which is the main defense of the Ukrainians in Kursk. And so if the Russians could taking Sheredivka would allow them to get one step closer to start taking under fire control and physically also cut this highway. So the battle for Sheredivka is ongoing. It looks like the Russians did a big attack and enter it, but we don't know the extent of it. Like, we don't know how much progress, and if the Russians managed to consolidate, if it got pushed out, so we have to wait for more to see if they actually managed to capture this village. But the battle for this is now ongoing. Also, in the south here in Suchka, it looks like the Russians trying to enter Suchka from the south are being contested. It looks like the village of Mekhanovka, which apparently the Russians captured, but then it got recaptured by the Ukrainians, and so now there's big battles going from Mekhanovka. Most sources say the Russians still have some positions in the south here, but it is a back and forth. The Ukrainians are trying to push the Russians out. The Russians are trying to keep holding their gains here, and I don't blame them. If the Russians could take Mekhanovka, this gives them a solid position to start, taking all these villages in the south of Suchka, and this will spell doom for the Ukrainians in Suchka. So I'm not surprised that the Russians and the Ukrainians are battling for Mekhanovka. But in any case, the Ukrainians managed to foil Russian plans to secure themselves here. So now the battle for this small village part of Suchka, the Suchka urban agglomeration, is still ongoing. Alrighty. And then in the northern part of the Kursk Oblast, the Russians are one of the main, actually biggest battles are going on for this line of village, the Malonovko area. The main goal for the Russians is to take the village of Malonovko, and what they're doing from here is they're using troops from in this area to push towards these villages. And it looks like the Russians are actually making a lot of progress. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians actually cutting the road between Victoria and Nikolaevsky here. And we don't have any we have geolocated footage of the Russians being, we also have geolocated footage of the Russians being taking the road between Stara Shirochki and Nikolaevka here. So we don't know how much the Russians are held here. So we have geolocated footage of the Ukrainians trying to bomb the Russians in these villages, but we don't know if the Russians managed to secure them. But obviously the main goal is to take these 4 villages for the Russians, and then they are going to be right up to the main prize, which is Malonovka, which is the main goal for the Russians to take. And if they could capture these 4 villages, then everything to the north here, Pokbepi, Orlovka, and Novosharana, will be completely cut off mostly, and so the Ukrainians will probably have to retreat from here, and then there'll be a big battle for Malonovka here, which has a prison, which is where the Russians managed to hold off the Ukrainians for a big while here. But if the Russians could, so the Ukrainians could hold on to this town for a lot longer, but the squeeze on Malonovka is continuing. And thus, once they could take Malonovka, they could start encircling Suchka from the north. Alrighty, that is the end of this week. Hope you guys enjoyed my video. Be sure to subscribe my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Be sure to like this video, share this video around, and comment your thoughts. So aim high and wander on.